Okay, well, I think we can start. Welcome to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft and today's event, which is entitled, "We Have the Most Powerful Military on Earth, so why can't we decisively win our wars?" I have a great panel designed for us today. Before that, if you're not familiar with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, we are an action think tank dedicated to promoting diplomatic engagement rather than global military primacy across the globe. We are named for one of our first and greatest statesmen, John Quincy Adams, who famously said that if America chose to become a nation that went in search of monsters to destroy, it would lose itself and its very identity. And I think that's in part what we're going to be speaking about today. We don't have a ton of time. We have about an hour, which we would like to include questions and answers from the audience. So please, audience, at the bottom of the screen, there is a box for Q&A. Please put your questions in that box, and we will get to as many as we possibly can within the next hour. I'm so proud to have these three individuals on this event today. I count them all as friends. I know them from different periods in their lives, in my profession as a reporter. And if I didn't introduce myself, my name is Kelley Vlahos, and I'm a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute. So I have three people here. I have Mandy Smithberger, who is a defense watchdog par excellence. I have a retired military officer, Daniel Davis. And I have Mark Perry, who is a longtime journalist, author, and truth teller, who I count, thankfully, as a colleague now at the Quincy Institute. All three of them are coming to this question from three different points. And I'm really excited to really get at the nub of the issue as to what is wrong with our military today. Is it strategy? Is it hubris? Is it culture? Is it the civilian masters? We're going to talk all about that, but I'm going to, get right into the questions, and I will introduce more formally my guests as we go along. I'm going to start with retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis. He is the author of a new book, which in part inspired this event today, called 11th Hour in 2020 America: How America's Foreign Policy Got Jacked Up and How the Next Administration Can Fix It. He currently serves as senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. He was deployed to combat zones 4 times in his career, beginning with Operation Desert Storm in 1991, Iraq in 2009, and Afghanistan twice in 2005 and 2011. He is widely published and was the recipient of the 2012 Ridenhour Prize for Truth Telling. He is a frequent guest. You might have seen him on Fox News, Fox Business News, BBC, and CNN. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today. And nice to see you. My pleasure.
Thanks for having me here.
Okay, so let's get right into your first question. You have written extensively about this issue in your new book. And I don't know if you have it there, if you kind of want to show the audience your new book, because I know you're very proud of it and it's very good. I've read it. And it just touches upon so much of what we're going to talk about today. But you've written about this in your new book. When reading the book, 2 major themes jumped out at me. You talk about your involvement in the future combat systems in the early 2000s, which promised that advanced technology would be able to surge a battalion of troops anywhere in the world, fully equipped and networked in 96 hours. After years and billions of dollars, it went nowhere. In the meantime, the forces needed to be prepared for the next threat, and 9/11 was wholly unanticipated. You talk about the changing goalposts in Afghanistan and how the Pentagon leadership clung to bad strategy and in essence lied to Congress about conditions on the ground to pursue that bad strategy, particularly during the surge in 2009. And I was remiss in not mentioning how you had been a whistleblower at the time, where you publicly published a report about how the generals were obfuscating the the realities on the ground in Afghanistan. And you really put your neck on the line by telling the world what was really going on. Can you talk a little bit about the culture in the military that leads to this mediocre, if not failed thinking and strategy, and why this leads to failed wars? And obviously against the backdrop of your own experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Yeah, some of it is a little bit counterintuitive in that it seems like what I'm going to say at first would actually help us win wars, and in certain cases it can, but it has a double-edged sword. And that is this propensity that we're trained from day one, whether you're a private, whether you're a fresh lieutenant, and all the way up through your entire career. It's that we have this can-do spirit, this can-do attitude. We're especially, I was in the armored cavalry, and we're the group that's designed to go out there to develop the situation when it's chaos, and hand off to other forces later on to develop the situation so that it can be fought with clarity later on. So by definition, we're sent into where everything is uncertain and there's enemy chaos, etc. And we have this attitude that no matter what we find, we're going to find a way to succeed. So if you give like the famous Charge of the Light Brigade kind of mission, and something can't be accomplished, we're going to find a way to make it work anyway. And it doesn't matter how bad it is. Now, that's good to a certain extent, but where that comes into a problem is what we saw both in the FCS program when I was in that program, when I was in that program, as well as the wars, but in Afghanistan in particular, which I've talked about a lot, in that it's not going well, it's not succeeding. But we have this idea that, no, if I just work a little harder, if I just do a little bit more, it's going to work. So I'm going to tell everybody what I think they need to hear so that they don't pull the plug, especially in Congress. And General Petraeus was one of the worst at this, honestly. That, he said, we're on the right azimuth, things are getting better. No, they weren't. And we weren't on the right azimuth. Things were never getting better. They were, in fact, getting worse at the time. But I know, especially for some conversations I had with some senior ranking officers during my time in the FCS program, that they were aware of this. They were aware of the perceptions, and they were afraid to tell Congress the truth of it. So I saw that directly in both cases, where they're afraid to tell the Congress because they're thought then they'll pull their support back. They won't support us, and then that would be bad for America because now we wouldn't be able to succeed. Now, you can get by with that for a little while. You can say, all right, well, we're on the cusp. But when you get into the second, fourth, 12th, 18th year, there is no excuse for that at all. And that's part of a culture that we have that can be good, but can be turned into bad. And unfortunately, the associated part of that is that we have this mentality that, if you want to get up in the ranks, if you want to succeed, if you want to get promoted all the way up there, especially to the general officers, then you better start playing the game. And you have to be part of the team. And you have to be loyal to not the Army as an institution, but to the group that's in charge of things. And so, one of the classic examples, which I think I mentioned in the book, is the general that was in charge of the FCS program when I was there. It was canceled by the Secretary of Defense about a year later after I'd gotten there. Well, the general that was in charge of it, you would think, would have left in disgrace and shame. No, he got a big award, one of the very prestigious awards, and a promotion to his second star. And then he continued to go up from there. So we actually reward people who don't succeed. And we've seen that time and time again. No one is ever held accountable for all of these disasters and all of these failures. And so that's got to be changed. But right now, that's some of the main things that I've seen throughout this is that, that there's, you won't tell the truth because you think you know better, and you won't tell the truth because you know that the guys who can get you promoted won't like it. And I think that's the main thing. And I'll just kind of stop it right there, and then we'll add some more questions as things continue to go on.
Yeah, let me introduce Mark Perry, because I would like him to follow up on that question, because I know you've written about this extensively in your own book, The Pentagon's Wars. Because I was going back over it this morning and I realized, wow, this is exactly what we're talking about, the real granular details of how, you know, the policy and the military just goes right off the rails right ahead of these wars. And then you look around and you wonder, why are we failing? But Mark Perry, who is a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute, he is a widely published military and foreign policy reporter and award-winning author. He has published 10 books, including The Pentagon's Wars, which I just held up, and The Most Dangerous Man in America, The Making of Douglas MacArthur in 2014, for which the Boston Globe named the best nonfiction book in 2014. He previously worked as a senior policy analyst and political director for Vietnam Veterans of America. So Mark, what do you think about what Dan just said about you know, rewarding failure for one?
Nothing succeeds in Washington like failure. You get promoted. I agree with him. I think it's particularly insightful when it comes to the military. And I agree that there is this kind of can-do attitude in the military that cuts against reality. When's the last time we heard a general appear before Congress and say, we're losing? And yet, over the last 20 years, since the start of the global war on terrorism, any number of generals knew that we were losing the war on terrorism, but never said so. But I think it's important to focus on the kind of original question, Kelley, that we have here, which is, why doesn't the U.S. win its wars anymore? And my kind of approach is, well, what do you mean by win? You know, I think that Americans are kind of spoiled by their view of World War II. We have an enemy, we reluctantly engage the enemy, we defeat them decisively, we provide them with a surrender document, they sign, the war's over. That's not what happens in wars. What happens in wars is that the two sides, or three or four, depending on the war, get exhausted and sign an armistice and then rearm and re-engage. We've seen this all over the globe, particularly in Europe, from the coronation of Charlemagne to 1945, the French and the Germans fought war after war after war, and nothing was ever decided until 1945. But even with the end of World War II, which we account as a decisive victory, the wars weren't over. After World War II, out of exhaustion, the international community came together and decided that they would have a series of partitions so we wouldn't go to war anymore. So we had a partition in Korea. We had a partition in Vietnam. We had a partition between India and Pakistan. We had a partition in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We had a partition in Europe. We had a partition in China between Taiwan and China. And look where we had wars. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, 6 wars in South Asia, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a Cold War in Europe. It went on and on and on and on. So the solution here is not to conclude that you fight wars and then you win. You realize that what really is happening in terms of conflict is that wars can be fought but not won. And once you understand this, I think it kind of changes your perspective about when you should or should not deploy troops. And I think the United States needs to be a little bit more reluctant when it deploys its troops overseas, because winning is something that rarely happens.
Yeah, and I entirely agree. And I realize the title of this event is a little cheeky. You know, well, we got the most powerful military on earth. Why can't we win wars? But it is politically expedient and beneficial for our political, you know, paymasters or the power structure of Washington to at least intimate to Americans that there is an end game, that there is a victory to be had. And so when the Soviet Union fell, the idea was that we had won the Cold War. And after 9/11, there was an expectation that we will win the global war on terror, or we will win against those who had committed the crimes on 9/11 against American people. And so there is at least a rhetorical suggestion that these wars can be won. And if we just hang on and we just pour more money and resources into these wars, that there will be an end game. And so I completely agree with what you say. But on the other hand, there has to be some buy-in from the American people. And I think that buy-in is this expectation that there is victory to be on hand, and that we would get something, and something, you know, that we can be proud of as an American people. The winning, getting back that old World War II feeling, that we would accomplish something with all of our blood and treasure. But what you bring up here is this perpetual war state that also benefits the military industrial complex, because if we're constantly at battle and in conflict, that really we're not expecting to win right away or decisively, that keeps the military industrial complex, the defense contractors, the tens of thousands of people who work in the Pentagon actually moving and grooving. And I want to bring Mandy in here because this is what she does for a living in terms of watching and hawking. And she knows her business better than anybody on this call. But let me introduce her first. Mandy Smithberger is director of the Center for Defense Information at the Project on Government Oversight, has previously served as National Security Policy Advisor to U.S. Congresswoman Jackie Speier. She has worked on passing key provisions of the Military Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act into law. Previously, as an investigator with POGO, she was part of a team that received the Society of Professional Journalists Sunshine Award for contributions in the arena of open government. And she is an expert on the Pentagon's revolving door and has talked about it and written about it quite extensively. She's appeared on CNN, Fox News, NPR, and has been cited by all the major newspapers on her research. So Mandy, taking everything that you've heard here so far, I did want to ask you, and I know none of it comes as any surprise to you, you've been working consistently on this revolving door issue, as well as reforming whistleblower laws so that when people on the inside try to ring the alarm on bad practices inside the DoD labyrinth, they won't be punished. Can you talk a little bit about the corruption in the programs and acquisition processes, and how perhaps the best programs, the best made programs, readiness to, is sacrificed for the desires of the defense industry in collusion with their minders in the Pentagon? In short, are our forces failing in these wars in part because they are equipped and trained according to the wars the military industrial complex wants to fight, not necessarily for what is happening in reality on the ground, in the air, at sea?
So we have just an hour right now.
I know it's hard.
No, it's a great question. So I think big picture, one of the major concerns that we have is that while we understand that the defense industry and defense contractors are always going to be a partner for the Department of Defense, we don't want them to be calling the shots. And particularly when you see the revolving door of senior Pentagon officials going to work for defense contractors, you see too often that what's considered to be in the best interest in the defense industry is just assumed to be what's in our best national security interest, even when it's not. I would urge everyone on this webinar to look at the Military Aviation Commission report that was just released, looking at why so many accidents are happening and how there are real costs to when these overpriced weapon systems are delivered late. There are real costs when we prioritize new procurement and take away training and take away spare parts, that we are losing lives that we don't need to lose because we're putting the interests of those defense contractors and perceptions of job creation ahead of what's actually in the best interest of our troops. And so our report, Brass Parachutes, looked at this extensively. And really what you see is that even people who are trying to do good in the system, who are trying to blow the whistle, there are so many people in leadership who are focused on what their next job is going to be, that they feel like they can't raise these kinds of concerns without it being complete career suicide. And as Danny was talking about, you see failure rewarded, because really what you were just supposed to make happen was you were supposed to keep the program going. You were supposed to keep increasing the budget. And it's not about performance. It's not about effectiveness. You don't really see people getting prizes for saving money at the Department of Defense. You're only getting prizes for helping to keep the spigot going. And, at the end of the day, I think the most important thing to consider is it making us safer? I mean, I think when we look at these endless wars, it's really hard to make the argument that this is something that has helped us. And are we getting, effective, lethal equipment? It doesn't really look like it, right? When we're having all of these kinds of crashes occurring, when we can't seem to win any of these wars. And it's a fundamental corruption of the system and a disservice to, men and women who volunteer to serve our country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you've been working, could you on this, well, can you specifically talk about, since we are in the midst of a transition and we have a new administration coming in, how does the revolving door affect a new administration that's quickly trying to mobilize and populate key positions in the national security and foreign policy establishment? How does the revolving door come into play, but also how could it really just set a bad tone for what the next 4 years are going to be like in that space?
I think both under the Trump administration and we're now seeing under the Biden administration, that industry is having pretty unparalleled access to making decisions about who's going to fill all of these different roles. When we had the delays in the transition, you had the Biden team getting briefings from board members, from Raytheon, and from other major defense contractors. And they're the ones who are determining who are the acceptable people to be nominated for these positions. And so now we have a Secretary of Defense nominee that is coming from the board of Raytheon, one of the largest defense contractors. And it's pretty gobsmacking how little difference there is between the beginning of the Biden administration when it comes to the Department of Defense and the Trump administration. In both cases, we have a former combatant commander from Central Command who was on the board of a major defense contractor. And those seem to be the only people that we're looking towards leadership. When I think after these wars, we need to be looking towards voices who weren't responsible for getting us where we are and who are really having an attitude towards reform. But the people who are in favor of reform are not going to be the people that the defense industry selects.
Danny, do you want to weigh in on that and maybe just to get this question off the table, because I know it's sort of looming ahead of us, the pick for Secretary of Defense, retired General Lloyd Austin, what do you think about that pick? Are you concerned about his ties to Raytheon or any other concerns? And how does that, as a Secretary of Defense, why is that problematic to have somebody who is connected, not only connected to the defense industry, but somebody who has been a career officer, a career military soldier, for the last 40 years in that role as Secretary of Defense? How does that sort of, or is it a good or a bad thing? I'm asking.
Yeah, in 2006, I was working as a liaison officer between Combined Forces Command Afghanistan and CENTCOM, and that was during the same time that General Austin was the chief of staff for CENTCOM at that time. So I actually had a fair amount of at least observation of him. I didn't directly interact with him, but I was in many of the same briefings and sometimes prepared for some of the briefings for him. And he seemed like a perfectly good guy. But nothing that would, as Mandy said, I think we really do need somebody who's, reformer, who's not just one of the standard guys from the people that have brought us a lot of these same problems right now. Initially when it looked like Michelle Flournoy was going to be the Defense Department pick for Biden, and there was lots of alarm bells ringing, lots of both right and left people were saying, hey, this is a problem because she has extensive ties to the defense industry, as well as some of the other think tanks that are also a lot of the revolving doors that are going out there. When I heard that that looked like that was going to have some impact and that Biden didn't select her at first, I was excited until I heard that they just got a different guy who'd been a revolving door person. And so that's almost like, well, it doesn't matter, it's this one or that one, but it's still from the same standard that's been going on forever. Like Mandy also accurately said, it doesn't matter Republican, Democrat. It seems like we just continue on the same policies time after time. And the reason why this is a problem is because you have the people that, first, on 2 points. First of all, they've been kind of the architects of a lot of these forever wars that we've been fighting unsuccessfully, and the things that haven't been succeeding, and have been unwilling to say, hey, this is not working. This is not in America's interest. Let's go this other direction. That never happens until these guys retire. Like, there was a famous general after the Afghan war that, wrote a book and said, oh, we did all these awful things and we failed America and all this, but he never said a word when he was actually on active duty and could have done something about it when it mattered. And so the same kind of situation here is that now we're putting those people in increasing positions of authority. When you come from industry in particular, especially when you're on the board of something, I mean, you're there expressly to help them increase their bottom line for their stakeholders and for their investors. They want to make a profit. That's fine. I mean, it's a company. That's what they're supposed to do. But when you're one of them that's helping them increase their bottom line, and now suddenly you're in the seat here that's going to make the decisions about what direction we go. I mean, it's not as though that someone has to, bribe them or tell them, hey, do this instead. It's just almost part of your DNA at that point, because that's what your job has been. So you're naturally going to be inclined to say, hey, you know what? We have these products here. I bet that would be really helpful. We should go after that too. So your primary thought is how that's going to be used to further defense. And you're almost looking for reasons or excuses to go in that direction, as opposed to someone who's just there because they're qualified to do the job, and they care about the advancement and the benefit of the United States and the effectiveness of the armed forces, which is what they're supposed to do. And now then, if there's a device from this company or from that company or something else that's going to help us, you go with what's going to help us, not with what's my former company was involved with. And of course, the expectation when they get out of there is they're going to go right back into them. And there's plenty of people that are happy to keep paying those salaries because it keeps working for them. And until we get to the point to where they're talking about giving General Austin a waiver here, which the law was put in place so that you have to be out at least 7 years before you can do it. Well, they waived it for Mattis, and now then they're ready to waive it here, which just basically means there is no more law, and it doesn't matter because they're almost certainly going to give it to them. And so that's just perpetuating the problem and making it deeper and deeper embedded in the system, and makes it even less likely that we're going to finally get somebody that can do the job.
Absolutely. Mark, I remember when Trump was elected and he started populating his cabinet with generals, and we were at the American Conservative Conference, and you said bluntly that everybody's talking about these guys as though they're the adults in the room, and you were basically like, be careful of what you wish for. Because they might be adults in the room, but they might not be pursuing the adult-like behaviors that you want. And I'm wondering what you think now about, you don't have to, go into specifics about Lloyd Austin unless you want to, but can you talk a little bit about having yet another general in charge of the Pentagon?
I guess so. You're known by your enemies. And I noticed this morning that there's mounting opposition to Lloyd Austin as Secretary of Defense. And I should probably keep a tally, but I think I'm being accurate in saying that those who question his appointment because he's not tough enough on China. Which for me, sounds like a reason we ought to make him Secretary of Defense.
Right.
So, I understand that there might be conflicts of interest here because he served on the board of Raytheon. And I understand the worries that raises. But it's hard to walk through Washington and not find anyone who doesn't have some kind of industry connection. They're not going to appoint Mark Perry Secretary of Defense. They're going to appoint a guy like Lloyd Austin. Lloyd Austin's career is filled with skepticism about American interventions. He was angered about the Saudi intervention in Yemen, thought it was ridiculous. He sided with Biden, albeit quietly, opposed to the increase of surge of troops in Afghanistan. He's reticent. He doesn't speak out. He's not a media personality. He doesn't carry 4,000 books around with him like James Mattis. He knows the military. He knows the building. He's got an impeccable career as a military officer. That doesn't cut against him. I think that he would be a good Secretary of Defense. Now, let me just add one other thing. Joe Biden has said that he's going to have 4 challenges when he's president. COVID, the economy, racial justice, and climate change. None of those, except climate change, are international foreign policy issues. They're all domestic. What we need in the Pentagon more than anything is competence. And Lloyd Austin is probably the most competent senior officer that we have. So why not? Who else would we get? There have been names mentioned. They're hard over neoliberal interventionists. Lloyd Austin to me sounds like a pretty good pick.
Mandy, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to remember that it's actually only a pretty recent phenomenon that we select our secretaries of defense directly from the largest defense contractors. That from, as the New York Times reported, from the George H.W. Bush administration until the Trump administration, we were able to find qualified individuals who weren't working for the biggest defense contractors. And I think it's important to look at how difficult it can be to manage some of these conflicts. So we had Patrick Shanahan, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense and a Boeing executive. And he admirably not only recused himself for the required period, but said he would for his entire time in his service. But when he spoke out about problems with the F-35, because that was manufactured by Lockheed Martin, who is a competitor to Boeing, he was accused of having unfair bias. And one of the problems with conflicts of interest is it means that you are always going to have your credibility questioned. And so your ability to authoritatively speak for the department comes into question if you can't show that you are going to be fair and unbiased. So I think it's going to be important in confirmation hearings to have a better understanding about how that conflict is going to be managed, and to see, as Danny was referencing, is he going to go just right back into the defense industry? Because I think that's really what colors people's behavior the most, is if they're thinking about what their next job is going to be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a ton of Q&A questions coming in. And so I'm going to ask one more question of my own because I had a bunch teed up, and I'm going to pick my favorite one. And I'm sorry, we just don't have enough time, but they're specifically one of the audience members, Harry Salzberg, is asking Mandy what the name of that CDA report you cited. And I don't know, do you have access to the Q&A yourself? Is there any way that you can answer him, or should I just?
I can type that. Yeah, I can.
Okay, good.
The military
I just want to expedite that so I don't forget. Okay, so here's my question. And I'm going to give a little plug to the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft's president, Andy Basevich, who is actually one of my favorite people on this subject, mostly because he tells it straight, no chasers, when everybody else in the town, in Washington tiptoes around these, uncomfortable truths about the military or are completely deluded. In his book, The Limits of Power, he said, this is one of the dirty little secrets to which the world's only superpower has yet to own up. As the US has come to rely more heavily on armed force to prop up its position of global preeminence, the quality of senior American military leadership has been consistently disappointing. First-rate generalship has been hard to come by. I'd like to ask each of you, why is this? And how did it get so bad that we have people like Andy Basevich and many others? I know Doug McGregor, who is also a friend of ours, has also often talked about the top-heavy military, and even those in the top are really mediocre. and really don't measure up. So what has caused this situation? And what is that? What is the impact on the military when we're talking about successes and failures in our policies? Daniel, I want to ask you that question first.
Yeah, that's a really good one. It's important to understand. In a sense, a general today is probably more related to a politician than a general, because the way the system works is technically it's the president that nominates and hires people to be generals, but in practice it's the generals that decide who gets to be a general. So good example, you saw H.R. McMaster in his formative years used to be kind of an outsider, was challenging the status quo and calling into questions a lot of the things that we'd been doing, and he was kind of considered as I don't know, tainted might not be the right word, but he was people were afraid of him because he wanted to change things. He wanted to change the status quo. So when even though he had been, a hero in Desert Storm and a hero in 2005, the only counterinsurgency effect success that we had in the tactical level, he got passed over twice to be a general, and then until David Petraeus finally he found favor with Petraeus, and Petraeus got him on the list. And so once Petraeus was convinced that he would be able to play ball and and help him with the things that he wanted to, which is how it turned out, then he got promoted. The guys who are reformers, the guys who are challenging the status quo, the guys who want to try new things, they almost never get promoted. I've saw so many in my own career of guys that I thought, wow, this guy's spectacular, because he doesn't just take, the rote answers or just the way things are normally done, but he has some really great ideas and is challenging this and that. And boy, if we go this way, it's going to work. Well, he didn't get promoted because the guys, I'm just telling you, it's just the truth. The guys who were above that are afraid of people who want to come in and change things, because whether they I didn't think of that, and he might challenge me if he gets up there, or just, I want to be in charge of this. Because, just think of the general officers, the last thing that they want is somebody to come in and say, hey, this war is not working. We need to shut it down. We need to do something besides what the group is saying. They don't want that. So they'll keep him out. And until that changes, until we change how generals are even selected, I just don't see how that's ever going to change.
Yeah, and somebody had mentioned Tim Backen's book in the Q&A. Edward White asked, has anyone read The Cost of Loyalty by Tim Backen? It is right on this topic. And, I had actually had a question that involved that book and my little list of questions here. And so I am going to just move on and just sort of to dig deeper into what Danny said and in my overall question. But if you're not familiar with this book, it's called The Cost of Loyalty, Dishonesty, Hubris, and Failure in the U.S. Military. It is written by Tim Backen, who is a West Point law professor. It blames in part the entire military culture, congealed over decades, reflecting insular, stagnant, dogmatic policies, separate rules, rituals, and reinforcement mechanisms that actually have a counterproductive effect on creative cognitive thinking. And he blames this on why, the US military can no longer win wars. He blames the service academies like West Point and the graduate schools like the US Naval Academy for inculcating this culture of conformity and turning the system away from a meritocracy and one that rewards those who keep their mouth shut and play the game well. These are provocative statements, but I believe they need to be addressed. Mark, is there anything in that you that rings true to you? And you can riff off of anything that Daniel said about the generals, and maybe talk a little bit about how a culture that has been created over time is responsible for this.
Yeah, I very much agree that the can-do attitude and the kind of the up and out culture of the military is to blame. But I'd like to turn it a little bit at the possible cost of appearing to be conservative. The reason that our generals don't succeed in war is we don't give them attainable goals. The goal in Afghanistan was to what again? I don't remember. It was something about the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And when we finished that, we decided to stay to escort school children to school. That's the job we gave the military, and to run the Afghan government. And, oh, by the way, eliminate corruption and take care of the drug problem and rebuild the infrastructure. This isn't what the military does. And yet we appointed commander after commander after commander and asked them why they hadn't succeeded. Well, they hadn't succeeded because the goals we gave them were not attainable. We should not be involved in these wars to begin with. For me, the litmus test of a great commander is a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or a combatant commander who sits down with the President of the United States and says, sir, we're ready to go, can do, and we'll do it. But sir, I hope you rethink this a little bit. And perhaps we shouldn't be in Afghanistan. Or perhaps you ought to put a more realistic time limit on it. Or perhaps you ought to sit down with your aid and development people and find out what the real problems are. Or perhaps we should anticipate the rise of an insurgency in Iraq, Mr. Bush. And if we do that, if we have military commanders who will sit down when they're in a position to, and instead of saying, yes, sir, right away, sir, say, yes, sir, but sir, that I think would be helpful. And it's that kind of culture that Daniel mentioned that we need to inculcate. And it's there in the military, but it's not prominent in the military, and it needs to be more prominent.
Absolutely. And Mandy, I would, just if you could follow up on that a little bit, because I think Mark is getting in the right direction of what these generals need to do, what is preventing them from speaking up and talking frankly the way that would need to be done to avoid failure. What are you seeing in the revolving door and in the Pentagon and all of your research in terms of which kinds of generals actually succeed and why we're getting the kind of generals in positions of power that we do?
Well, and I'd like to even bring it to a lower level first and kind of look at what are the lessons that they learn as they're coming up through the system. So I think it's important to, and it's hard to overstate how brave it was for Danny to come out and speak about his concerns about the war in Afghanistan, that the system of protections for military whistleblowers, to call them whistleblower protections is a Trojan horse. They really aren't effective and they don't protect people who dissent. And again, when you have a system where it's how can we make sure that programs go forward, you see that dissenters, people who raise questions, are not promoted, that it's much harder for them to make it through. You do have some people who are saved, but generally, because the business of the Pentagon is largely seen as being the business of defense contractors, you don't see that kind of honesty that we would like to see in the system. And we don't protect and reward people who do speak truth to power. And that's a failure on us.
Kelley, if I could riff real quick off something Mark said, I thought he brought up a really important issue, and I thought of a couple of really good examples of it. It is important, and the generals should do exactly what he said there. Yes, sir, you give me this order, and I'll do everything I can to accomplish it, but you need to understand here's the reality and the likely outcome, et cetera. But here's what we have seen because of who ends up getting up there. There was a famous exchange in the Jonathan Alter book during the detailing the Obama surge and the thought process that led up to it. And Obama, who had no military background at all, was relying on his senior military advisors and on, at that time, I believe it was CENTCOM Commander David Petraeus. And so he said, hey, all right, here's the strategy we're going to go with. We're going to go in there, we're going to build up big, and then we're in 18 months, we're going to start coming down. Does anybody think we can't do that? And Petraeus said, yes, sir, we can do it. He said, nobody's going to come back later and say, oh, well, now we need more time. If you don't think we can do it, say so now. Yes, sir, we can get it done. That's what he's reported to have said. Then in 2013, you have the outgoing commander of the Afghan war who stands up there in 2013 as change of command and says, this is winning. This is victory. This is what winning looks like. We should not be ashamed to say it. And I'm like, that was a year after I already detailed how we were losing. And yet all America hears is what Petraeus said at his hearings, and then what this guy's saying being reported on. They don't know what I know on the ground. And I guess if you're going to listen to two four-star generals or one lieutenant colonel who you'll never hear from again, you can see why people are going to listen to this. But that was the wrong answer then, and yet that continues to go on. And he ended up getting, other jobs after that.
Right, and you can see when the Washington Post published the Pentagon papers, the Afghanistan papers, you had scores of military officials, State Department officials, and whatnot who had admitted off the record that our strategies were failing and that they never thought that they would succeed. But those tapes, those interviews had been leaked to the press. They would have never gotten out if they hadn't been. But the fact that so many people within the Washington power structure knew that this was a failed strategy in Afghanistan, but yet we're afraid to say so publicly. That's an indictment on those people, but just the system in general that kept them from speaking out. We have a ton of
one last thing,
ahead.
real quick, because it talks about what both Mandy and Mark said in their recent few comments here, is that there is some good people in there. There are some qualified people. I did see, even during my time in Afghanistan, some general officers who absolutely recognized the truth. And I literally, in one particular engagement, saw the general grit his teeth when he heard what he was being ordered to do and what they were being told. And those are the kind of people that do exist that we need to somehow find and then elevate.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't agree more. Okay, so I'm going to try to get through a few of these questions. We have a bunch of people who, really want to sort of get back to the key question here. We have Mikhail Behrens and Joy Ann Grun, for example, are asking, what does it really mean to win? Define what you mean by winning a war. My husband, Michael Vlahos, who likes to get on these events and ask tough questions, has given me a real doozy, but I'm going to distill it down. Basically, he says in the last 20 years, America's military has moved towards law enforcement, a law enforcement ethos, which is, obviously designed to be in perpetuity and not really have the sort of buy-in from the American people, nor does it want the buy-in from the American people. This is a good question. Does the system, the military, industrial complex, if you will, really want to win wars? Or is everything designed to keep us on a perpetual war track? And when we question it, then they come out and they talk about winning and losing and just hang on for that victory. But, is it designed today as more of a law enforcement ethos in which winning nobody wants to win? I mean, nobody within the system wants to win. Mark, do you want to tackle that one?
Not particularly, but I will. I'm old enough to remember the dissent in the Vietnam War, and the theme of the dissenters was, this war, the only reason we're in Vietnam is because it's good for the military industrial complex. This is economic growth. Well, after the end of the Vietnam War, the United States went through an economic downturn that I remember well, because I was one of its victims, where the streets were dark, the gas stations were closed, the restaurants were shuttered. We had inflation out of control, and it was a catastrophe. And it was the direct result of the bankruptcy that happened in our economy because of the spending in the Vietnam War. And I think things have changed a little bit since then. So that I agree with Mandy that the ties between military and industry are so much tighter and so much dependent on each other. But I still think it's somewhat of a myth that wars are good for the economy. Wars are good for the military industrial complex. In the short term, there's no question the building of weapons is very, very lucrative. But long term, And all you have to do is look at our deficits, and they're going to come due. Long term, wars are not good for the American economy. They're not good for the American people. They're not good for our young people. They're not good for the military. And they don't work. What are we doing? We need to get out of these wars. We need to stop spending this money. We can decouple our military from industry. It's going to take a while. It's going to take work on the part of people like Mandy and Dan to do it, but it can be done. But I think it's a myth that somehow, there's huge profits to be made by war. Short term, that's very, very true. Long term, it's a disaster.
So Mandy or Danny, do you think that, I mean, is the game rigged? Do they really not want to win these wars?
I don't even think I'm that cynical, but I think that's where you see one of the real costs of this kind of corruption, though, is that it sure does look that way, right? That there is profitability and it always in an endless war and always having this kind of presence and exaggerating every threat that could, possibly come up. So you see some short-term profits for that, but I don't think it's quite that simple, but you certainly see how pursuit of profits and money is polluting the system. And it's part of why the public questions and actually often just wants to forget about these wars that we're in.
Danny?
Yeah, and I think that Mark has mentioned this in sideways a couple of times already. And there's a great example of this. And I actually literally finished writing something right before this panel began. So it's really fresh in my mind, is that we don't give missions that can be accomplished. That is one of the primary things. That's a dual combination of civilian leaders who are given the military missions that are not militarily attainable. So you can never succeed at accomplishing those that whose accomplishment would then signal the end of the conflict. Then it would be over. Like take Berlin, for example, knock them out of the war, then the thing's over. So that's a military attainable task that can be done. Or like we did in Desert Storm, kick Saddam out of Kuwait. Once he was out, the tactics were completed and the mission was finished. But now then, and the issue at hand here was the resistance that people were having to end the military mission in Somalia. We're talking about 700 guys. It's hardly anything. It's a very tiny number here. And yet the mission that they're given is to deter al-Shabaab and to help the African Union and several other places, Somalia, the government, whatever, get better for their people or some vague thing like that. Those are not militarily attainable tasks. You can't measure degraded, because if you do, you will literally never leave. And so we keep giving these missions that can't be accomplished, like Bush in 2007 in Iraq and Afghanistan said, okay, we're going to make basically nation building. He listed a whole list of things. The military can't accomplish nation building tasks. Obama did the same thing when he came in there. These are not tasks that the military can accomplish. So when you give something that can't be militarily attained, then the military won't ever leave. And then the problem is that people get into this mentality and they frankly get comfortable with forever war. And so now they're actually afraid of shutting any of them down because they are afraid something bad might happen, even though there's no justification for it. And if we had another hour, I can tell you why we're safe without any of these deployments. But the bottom line is we are. But until we change what the missions are, none of these will ever end.
Right. Yeah, and that several people have asked that in the Q&A, about, whether or not these forever wars are actually making us safe or getting out would actually make us safe. But let me, we have a question from a gentleman by the name of Steve Nadamast. I hope I'm not mispronouncing his name. So he's kind of looking forward and he says, so how are we to get better personnel in vital senior defense positions in government when the federal government really does not have any control over the defense industry? We have no one who will make, do we have no one who will make such selections? And I think what they're asking is like, how do we reverse this revolving door where we could actually get the right people in and weed out the people who are just self-interested and are serving the blob in the military industrial complex rather than the American people? And can we do that? Mandy, maybe you should take this one on first.
Yeah, I think we start with strengthening our laws around ethics so that we are going to have better people to choose. And if everyone has to follow the same rules, I think we're going to see better selections in who we actually have as for these positions. I think an important aspect as well about Austin is that we need to also diversify our national security community significantly. So we haven't talked about the racial side of the problem in this conversation, but that's another area where we need to be increasing the diversity in thought. We need to look at who's being promoted, and so that we will have a national security, a Pentagon that actually represents the American people and the different interests and ideas that we have to contribute, and also honors the contributions of all kinds of Americans to our national security.
Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to plow through a bunch of these, like in almost like a lightning round, and just ask who I think might be best to answer it. Here's an interesting question from John David. He talks about the defense industrial complex. If we want to reform the interaction of the defense industrial complex and refocus on winning wars, how do we reorganize the economic engine to undermine the loss of American jobs argument? I think what he's asking is, how do you avoid that, that argument that somehow if we reduce spending on the Pentagon and weapon systems and the military industrial complex, that we would be losing jobs for Americans? And, I know this is a big discussion. Can we refocus our energies on other industries rather than war making? Mark, do you find this is sort of like an untenable argument that, somehow we have to stay in this deficit spending situation because we'll lose American jobs and make things worse for people domestically?
I think people don't remember that during the Clinton years, when Clinton became president of the United States, he drew down the defense budget with what he called a peace dividend. Now, he cut end strength of the U.S. Army by 300,000 soldiers. I think it is, it's difficult. I don't deny that it's difficult to retool and repurpose defense industries to a peacetime agenda, but it is doable because it's been done before. We did it after World War I, we did it after World War II, we did it after the end of the Cold War, and it is very doable. It's difficult, but I think it's going to be. We're at the point now where it's going to. We have to do it. We're going to have to cut the defense budget. The military certainly expects that will happen. If I could, and let me just add. Let me just take on another question here by Mikhail Behrens. I'm sorry if I mispronounced the name. And he asked, and I'm desperate to kind of hit this one out of the park, Kelley, so I apologize.
No, go ahead.
If winning is not feasible, what can be achieved by military power? And I remember asking this question of Caspar Weinberger in the mid-1980s when I was a young reporter. Why are you buying all these weapons? We're going to go to war. And he said, oh, Mark, you don't get it. We're not buying the weapons in order to go to war. We're buying the weapons so we don't have to. So we've kind of lost the idea of deterrence. Now, I'm not saying we should buy more weapons, but when you start deploying troops in serial wars overseas through 20 years, it kind of blunts the threat that you have of using the military. We need to pull back. It's fine to have a powerful military. I'm not against the powerful military, but this is out of control and we need to pull back. So I just thought I'd take on the question, Kelley.
No, and I'm glad you did, because I think that's a good capstone for our conversation, because I'm noticing that it's 3:00 and we've run out of time. And I'm so sorry because, there was a bunch of other questions in the queue and I had some additional questions, but I think that we fleshed this out as much as we could in an hour. And I really want to thank Mandy, Daniel, and Mark and the audience for all of your dynamic questions. And, please, if you're interested, go to our website, Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, as well as our online magazine, responsiblestatecraft.org. We got plenty of of stuff on all of these issues and more. We have regional issues, we have Pentagon related issues, we have grand strategy and analysis. And so, and we hope to have more events like this one because I think there's just so much more to talk about. So thank you for being with us and happy holidays to everybody. And I think we're going to wait a minute or two until our live stream is wrapped up.